Hi, I'm Barbara Washburn with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and I'm going to be moderating this panel today to discuss dry well guidance and permitting in the region. Okay, so to start with, I thought we just review what a dry well is. I figure most of you probably know what a dry well is, but we'll just take a quick minute to look at a couple of different designs. By definition, well, let me back up. The US EPA fall under the US EPA Class 5 underground injection control systems. So they're often referred to as UICs as well as dry wells. And by definition, they are holes in the ground that are deeper than they are wide. And in these three, Dahlia, which one is? In these three diagrams here, there we go. Better? That's better? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Settle out, and so it will not get into the subsurface. And pretreatment can come in the form of structural, such as you see in these two designs here, or vegetative. The Liddy initiative down on the Central Coast developed a design that had a bioretention cell as its pretreatment with the same function. So there are challenges that dry well address. As everybody knows, we have lots of clay in our soil, and getting infiltration very far down into the subsurface is challenging because of the clay layers. And dry wells are a great way, especially considering their small footprint, to overcome this challenge. However, there remain complex regulatory challenges, and that's the focus of the discussion today. One of them is the local interpretation that has been given to DWR's water well regulations has led to sort of a kibosh being put on the use of dry wells in our region. There have been development projects that have included dry wells that haven't gone forward due to the inability to get them properly permitted. And Mike Floyd, sitting at the end there from the Department of Water Resources, he's with the Water Well Program, is going to help clarify and explain these bulletins and what they mean for dry wells. Another challenge we face in our region is the absence of a clear permitting structure under the Porter-Cologne Act. Tim O'Brien was going to address that. He is unable to speak today about it. I'll say a few words about it. Running off of his slide, I'll sort of try to wing it because I think it is important that something be said about what is going on to address this need. And lastly, our state lacks statewide guidelines for siting and design. It's a little bit of the Wild West in the state, both in terms of permitting and design and siting. How far from a water well should a dry well be sited? What kind of land uses is it appropriately used upon? A whole bunch of questions. And Matt Freeze is going to discuss this. He'll address it. The Storms program is developing an approach to take this on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Mike to talk about the Bulletin 748190.
Good morning, everyone. While they load up the slides, I'll give you just a little bit of an overview. As Barbara mentioned, there has been an issue about DWR's well standards and what they do and they don't say about stormwater injection wells. I'll use the term injection just because that's the way they're referred to in the DWR's well standards. So today I'm going to my intention today is to give everybody kind of a high-level view of why DWR develops well standards, what they cover, what they're intended to do, and then quickly get into a few areas where perhaps they're being misinterpreted, and then finally address some needs when it comes to well standards. So you could advance to them, or is that for me to do? Yay, figured it out. Okay, so quick a disclaimer, I'm going to delve a little bit into the water code. I'm a non-attorney spokesperson, so I am not an attorney, I'm an engineer. So a lot of this is my interpretation, and but I don't think I'm too far out on a limb on this. It seems pretty straightforward to me, and it's also kind of a long-standing history about the application of the standards. So with that, I will move on. All right, DWR's well standards. The water code giveth and taketh away, and our authority and our responsibility comes from the water code. I've got some citations down there, and I've given you a few citations that you could look at. And before I go on too long, if you're too far, if you are interested in laws that pertain to water wells, may I suggest that you go to the website, our website. I would suggest Googling DWR well standards. Is the best way to go. Unfortunately, we just redesigned a lot of our websites, so I can't find things, but hopefully you can find them that way. I'll leave some business cards there if you want to pick them up, you're really interested in it, and you're worried that you may not be able to find them or find our well website. I'll be glad to help you if you want to give me a call. But there is a booklet on the website. It looks like that. It's got a blue cover. And it's basically, we went through the water code and the health and safety code and picked out various laws that pertain to wells, water wells principally. We're not talking about oil wells, fracking, anything like that. All right, so what the legislature has charged us with the responsibility of dealing with well standards that do two things. Prevent the entry of contaminated surface water, and I underline contaminated for a reason, to usable groundwater, and then also the mixing of poor quality groundwater with unusable groundwater. So both of those things can occur if a well's not properly designed. In the first case, if you have a well bore that's open, surface water can flow into it in an uncontrolled manner. You don't know what's going on around there. Sometimes even people with domestic wells, when they go to buy a house and they have a well test, it'll have high fecal coliform. Well, let's see what's going on there. Oh, there's, an open well bore and you've got chickens, walking around. Gee, what a surprise. We got a problem. So, but it can get a lot more serious than that than in industrial areas. And then also, some of you may be aware that there are groundwater strata that have high levels of dissolved solids, salts, if you will, contaminants, et cetera, and a well, if it's not properly constructed and there's not a proper seal between the casing and the well bore itself, you can have inter-aquifer communication, and it could lead to degradation of groundwater quality. And then finally, the last thing I have there in yellow, although the Health and Safety Code doesn't charge the Department of Water Resources in developing standards to prevent wells from constituting a safety hazard, small children and animals in particular how could we not include those provisions in the state well standards? And we do that. And it's fairly simple and straightforward. It's about destroying wells properly, putting caps on them, and when they're in operation, that kind of thing. So here's how they work. DWR is charged with developing the well standards, again, with those two criteria that I mentioned before. There's two goals. And they are minimum statewide standards. They're not the meet-all to end-all. We have to develop standards across the state. Conditions vary all over the place, so we have to come up with basically a baseline. Those standards are applied at the local, well, let me go to the box right below the one on the left. The model ordinance, what's that all about? Well, we develop the standards, but there has to be an implementing mechanism to do that. So the state board, and this is all in that statute handbook that I showed you earlier, the state board is responsible for developing a model ordinance. That basically is a means of implementing those standards. So let's go back up to the top level again, look at the standards. A lot of people don't know this or aware of this, but the regional boards have a responsibility in the water code to look at regional conditions and decide if they recommend standards that are more strict in a particular area than what DWR provides on a statewide basis. Now, why would that be needed? Well, an example would be you've got a badly contaminated aquifer and you want to make sure that a well is not going to allow communication between the good water and the bad water. That'd be an example. I'm not aware of any instances where the regional boards have stepped in that regard, but it may have occurred. So the state standards, maybe the ante is upped by the regional board, then they go to the local agency. And that's the, I don't know how to use the, there we go, we're right there. So there we have local standards. So a local enforcing agency, that's what LEA stands for in that box. They enforce the standards. They can, as long as they have standards that are equal to or greater than what DWR has put out there, they can develop their own standards and they can up the ante there as well. It's not done too often, but there are places where that occurs. The other thing is if down here, there's a local agency, local enforcing agency, and that's typically a county in most areas of California who do the permitting. There are a few cities and water districts that do that as well. Their responsibility is to develop their own ordinance for implementing the well standards. If they do not do that, and it gets a little complicated in the statutes, but I'll just, looking at this at a very high level, if they don't do that, then the state board's ordinance comes into effect. So I hope that gives you, whoops, looks like there was a typo, sorry. That's supposed to say Regional Water Quality Control Board, or local standards, excuse me. I'm sorry, regional standards. Okay, what are the types of wells that the standards cover? Well, there's water wells, that's pretty straightforward there. Production wells, I'll get to the point where that also includes injection wells. Monitoring wells, those are where you drill a well and for the purposes of checking water levels, checking water quality. Those are typically small diameter, a lot less expensive than production wells, which are water wells. Some municipal supply wells, they're very large. They can several $1 million in cost. So there's a big difference in those, typically in construction. Cathodic protection wells. Those are kind of interesting. There are, maybe put this very simply, for those who aren't familiar with this, is pipelines, et cetera, are subject to corrosion because of electrical currents, and there's places where there's a lot of stray electrical currents because of grounding. You have ground rods in your house, electric rail lines, all kinds of things like that. So these wells are put in, they're very specialized. They have an anode placed in the ground, and similar to a well, except there's something stuck in the ground and force current to go in one particular direction. And that's what those are. And then finally, geothermal heat exchange wells. That's a relatively new requirement of the department. We have standards for those in development that's going extremely slowly, and I'll explain why here in a second. But at this point, those standards are formative. All right, you don't have to read all this stuff. This is for later if you want to read it. But if you look at the first citation or the first quote under 13.710, you'll see the second highlighted part. A water well includes wells for injecting water into the underground. And then the second down here, there are a few conditions where we're not to get in the way. The DWR's well standards are not to get in the way of other standards like those that have to be developed by the state for Class 1 hazardous injection wells. Ooh, egads, why would you inject hazardous materials in the underground? Well, that's a good question, but it's often when those things are done, they're done at extremely great depths and hopefully very significant layers would impede movement of those contaminants anywhere else. Sorry. All right. Where do people get confused? There's folks out there that think that DWR's well standards preclude stormwater injection wells. They don't, in my opinion. Part of that is, remember that one requirement at the very beginning about preventing the introduction of contaminated surface water into usable groundwater? And the reason I underline contaminated is, yeah, you don't want that to happen. But if you want to inject clean water that won't degrade groundwater, you're not, that's not antithetical to the well standards and their purpose. So there is a paragraph in our standards are contained in basically two bulletins. This is 7481, that you can find on our website. I won't go into this, but it's a really poorly worded thing, and it sounds down here, the word dry wells, drainage wells are used, but so people look at that and they read this and it says, well, that thing says you can't have those. Well, let me take you back again. To dispose of unusable wastewater that contain into usable quality. So where all that goes, I think, and people, this is what people really need to consider. If you are purposefully managing the injection of surface water into groundwater, and you're doing that in a manner that's protective of groundwater quality, the state well standards don't have issue with that. On the other hand, what they do have an issue with is the uncontrolled entry, non-purposeful, if you will, of surface water into groundwater that can pose a threat to groundwater quality. So when it comes to stormwater injection wells, and Barbara has mentioned that we've had conversations about this and also in her presentation, when you have to have a well that's designed, maintained, and operated properly, if you have that and it doesn't pose a threat to groundwater quality, it's not an issue for the well standards. Okay, so now here's the great news. California well standards, I just have to put a plug in here, they really need to be updated. By the way, whoops, I'm sorry, that was my poor sad dog that needs some love picture. Just like the well standards. So I mentioned to you the 7481. Now there's this other bulletin that contains well standards too, and that is 7490. The dash, the 74-81 means it was published in 1981. The 7490 means it was published in 1990. This top document, it's been 27 years. It's still a draft. It modifies parts of 7481 and it includes monitoring wells and cathodic protection well standards. So I can, if anybody wants to know why it's still a draft, I can give you some reasons why it was put out as a draft and then lack of resources after that. So 7481 is obviously very old. A lot of things have changed. Materials have changed. Technology has changed. I mean, we're not talking, wells are not rocket ships, but they can get pretty complicated, and especially when you're talking about large municipal multi-million-dollar municipal supply wells. So the other thing is DWR hasn't had an active well standards program for a long time. And I did pass over one point, and that is the well standards themselves don't adequately address injection wells. And what I mean by that is, there's more types of injection wells other than stormwater injection wells that involve the use of pressure, high pressure pumps. So you can imagine some considerations that might come into play on that. So there's all kinds of reasons we need to go and look at or update those standards. And we do not have a program. Despite me being here today, this is kind of a bootleg operation. I think about well standards maybe a couple hours every 6 months. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. We're going to save questions until the end, so Matt Freeze will be up next discussing the initiative to develop guidelines for using dry wells in California.
Hi, thank you. My name is Matthew Freeze. I'm an engineer for the State Water Board, and I'm going to share about a contract that I'm going to be managing, the statewide standards for stormwater capture and infiltration wells. First, I work to implement the stormwater strategy, or as we like to refer to it, the strategy to optimize resource management of stormwater, or storms. It was established in 2016. There are 23 projects that we'll implement over 10 years. And the purpose is for the vision, which is to see stormwater sustainably managed and utilized in California. Our mission is to advance the perspective that stormwater is a valuable resource. And in implementing this, or in pursuing the mission, we have come across dry wells. So Barbara did a great job of introducing dry wells, and I will just real quickly go over that they are subsurface devices used to infiltrate fluid, and that they commonly incorporate pre-treatment features in low-risk areas to water quality. It might just be a sedimentation chamber or a vegetated swell. In high-risk areas, it may be oil and water separators or activated carbon. In any case, in whatever the design, maintenance is key. This is an example of a dry well. It's a two-stage dry well with a pre-treatment feature. I won't go into it as Barbara did. Dry wells, they're also more formally known as injection wells. The state of California, again, defines them as a shaft, pit, hole in the ground that is deeper than it is wide, into which fluid or waste is discharged. And the federal government says that it is a well into which fluids are being injected. And Barbara mentioned the UIC program, the Underground Injection Control Program. They classify stormwater wells as Class 5, or Class 5 wells. And they also include recharge wells and saltwater intrusion barrier wells. So the storms program, we recognize that dry wells are in use throughout California. We also anticipate the use of these wells to increase to meet the needs or the goals identified by the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. We have also identified or recognized the need for regulatory clarification, as well as statewide criteria for the siting, design, construction, and maintenance, and to consider monitoring for these systems, and all of this for the protection of groundwater. To meet this need, we've put together a contract. It's a 2-year contract. We're currently in the request for qualification phase. It's a maximum amount of $150,000. It's open to all eligible firms and individuals, and what we are expecting as a final product is criteria for the siting, performance design, construction and maintenance, and when monitoring should be considered. Examples, so for siting, distance from drinking water wells might be an example of criteria of the performance design, infiltration rates, construction and maintenance, how often do these need to be cleaned, and as Dahlia pointed out, who is going to clean them, and then monitoring, when and where should monitoring be done. We anticipate that, in developing the criteria, the contractor should develop a technical advisory committee that is representative of municipals, regulators, and consultants. They will help with the development of the criteria and also review and suggest revisions. Key dates. So the request for qualification is out now. It's due in a week from today, next Thursday on March 7th by 3 p.m. We'll have interviews the first week of April, and we anticipate the contract being, the start date to be May 2018. So the end date should actually be May 2020. If you are interested, you can visit the webpage caleprecure.ca.gov. You can click on Get Public Procurement Information and then see current bids. The search function works pretty well if you just type in dry wells, or you can write down RFQ 17083 250. And again, they're due next week. If you have questions on the RFQ, you can contact Amber. Her information's on this slide. If you have questions for the scope of work, you can ask me. And so with that, I think we'll take questions or do a panel.
Oh, yeah, my question is related to the criteria, RFP, if you're able to answer it. Is the criteria specific to urban areas, or does it also include agricultural or rural areas?
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere, okay. And do you anticipate that it will also include criteria for the pretreatment BMPs, or just specific to the dry wells?
Yeah, we will consider BMPs and hope that that's part of it.
Okay, thank you.
My question is for Mike. Coming here, I had questions about the bulletins and why the language for infiltration really didn't address stormwater. And was it because DWR felt stormwater didn't pose a threat for polluting groundwater? But after your presentation, would you say that the answer to that is it just wasn't added, the bulletins are outdated, and moving forward, it'll do a better job of addressing injections?
I don't think,
On your second part, yeah.
Thank you.
Assuming we can get some funding.
That's the hat. No, just kidding. Thank you.
thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to bring our